Good afternoon, and I want to thank you for joining me. My name is Matt Hinesley, and this is my oral defense of my paper, where I write on the thesis topic that although Paul's phrase, husband of one wife, has differing interpretations, Scripture affirms, I believe, the interpretation of a one-woman kind of man. So thank you again for joining in with us. Thank you, Dr. Vandercook, for all that you have done for our class and for helping to guide us and educate us through the COVID-19 era of life in America. And thank you, classmates, for your comments on all the work that I've done so far, all the constructive criticism. I really do appreciate it, and I've tried my best to apply that to my work. I chose this topic, number one, because I believe culture and context, especially in Scripture, is very, very important. The way we understand it, the way we interpret it is very difficult, but it's something that we must do. I think oftentimes, especially in the South, in what's been called in the past the Bible Belt, I think sometimes we overemphasize the law over grace. And then in some places we even emphasize grace way too much over even any following of the law. So to understand the culture and the context of what God meant when the gospel writers wrote what they wrote. And so for me, when Paul wrote this passage, there's been a lot of differing interpretations, a lot of arguments over it, a lot of divisions within the church. And so for me, I wanted to come to an understanding of what it meant and what it really was. I didn't want to rely on what a pastor somewhere in some place said or what one denomination may believe over the other. I wanted to come to an understanding the best I could of what God had to say on the subject. So I learned a few things that I'd like to share with you this morning. One is I learned just how much divorce does affect ministry. It happens very often in the lives of ministers and in their families. It's ultimately one of the greatest decisions, if not one of the most important decisions that a minister will ever make, is in choosing the woman that he will ask to marry him. Not that she has and plays the whole role in what happens with divorce in ministry or marriage and ministry. He has his part to do, but man, we have to make that choice so carefully. I have a dear friend and mentor who has taught me probably as much about ministry as anybody else, who recently passed away this year. And he lost his pastorate many years ago when his wife left him, decided she didn't want to be a pastor's wife anymore, and she wanted out, and he had no choice. And so they got a divorce, and the church asked him to resign. But man, this guy was one of the most godly men I've ever met. And to me, he didn't qualify to be a man to be kicked out of ministry. So for me, I wanted to know what I could say if somebody asked me what I could do. And so I've learned how much that affects. I've learned how hurtful, even from speaking to his family, rejection is for leaders, especially when rejected for something that may have happened way in their past or something that they could not avoid. And I've also learned just how much history affects our interpretation. We're told a lot of things by pastors and books, but that is no substitute for asking God to show us. And so I've learned just how important that is. To get into the strengths and weaknesses of my paper, weaknesses for sure, is the use of technology. That is something that's always been really difficult for me to learn. I've always been very slow at gathering that, and I have not been in class. Well, let's just say this. The last time I was in class was over 15 years ago. And so learning what Turabian tells me to do, learning what Dr. Vandercook, what you would like us to have in our paper, and making my computer do that has been the most difficult part of this process for me. Getting the ideas out, doing the research, to me, was something that I was very comfortable with, but it was the technology and ultimately putting it all together and making it right according to Miss Turabian, was certainly the most difficult thing And I think that just comes from the fact that, man, in the last 15 years, you just haven't wrote many papers. I've wrote a lot of Bible studies, a lot of sermons, but not many papers. And so that was very difficult for me. Some strengths in my paper, I think, would be that I am motivated to write this paper, number one, for the sake of class, number two, because this topic is important to me, but number three, because assuming I pass this class, I get to graduate. And that is something I never, ever thought that I would ever actually finish over these last 15 years. So for me, that was so important for me, was getting that done, showing my teenagers, showing my students that you can get it done, that I would recommend they not wait this many years to graduate from college, but you can get it done. And so that's a little bit about my paper, a little bit why I chose to do it. And I just really believe that the Apostle Paul was pointing us in a direction of a man being a one-woman kind of man, a man who has a track record of loving his wife, a man who has a track record of being a godly individual without a wandering eye, that has a reputation that is godly and one who seeks and desires the Lord in everything that he does, and that he did not intend that should a man have gotten a divorce a while back or something happened out of his control, that should just automatically, one and done, without thought, disqualify him for ministry. So it's been a great time working on this paper, and I appreciate y'all's help, and I look forward to reading your papers as well. Have a good afternoon, and thank you for your time.